everyone. My name is Joe Clark. I'm a visiting assistant professor in the Department of American Studies, and it is a pleasure, a thrill for me to introduce Dr. Marcia Chatelain today. Marcia and I met when we went to graduate school together at Brown University. And she taught me so much then. She's been teaching me stuff since then. And it's such a thrill that she's going to be able to teach us all something today. When Officer Darren Wilson of the Ferguson Police Department shot Michael Brown in suburban St. Louis this past summer, it brought issues of race, policing, inequality, and civil rights into sharp focus. It also mobilized a community and a movement. Like most people, I watched TV and I followed events online, trying to understand what had happened and figure out what it would mean and what it might mean for race relations, for civil rights, for police oversight, for communities of color, and for the country as a whole. I was also trying to figure out how I might help my students make sense of these things and see them in historical, social, economic, cultural contexts, because that's what I do for a living. And as I searched for more information online, in print, and on Twitter, I found the hashtag Ferguson Syllabus. This hashtag connected me to other teachers trying to do exactly what I was trying to do, which was trying to figure out how we were going to teach this stuff in our classes. Remember, this happened in August. We're all in the middle of syllabus prep in August, so I had to figure out how I was going to talk about this. And what I didn't know, and this hashtag Ferguson Syllabus became really, really important to me, very useful to me, and I met all these other teachers online who were doing the same thing as I was, and they shared their resources with me, and I shared with them, and it created exactly what I needed, which was a community to think through these things so that I could then communicate that stuff to my students and help them. And I didn't know it right at the beginning. I found out really quickly that this absolutely necessary tool that I needed, and just the perfect tool for the perfect moment, had been initiated by my friend and colleague, Dr. Marcia Chatelain. And so she did what was necessary. It was kind of a simple thing, but it was what was necessary at the time. And so it's my pleasure to introduce her. Dr. Chatelain is a graduate of the University of Missouri, so she has a background in the St. Louis area. She earned her PhD in American Studies from Brown University. She is currently an assistant professor of history at Georgetown University, where she writes and teaches about African American migration, women's and girls' history, and food studies. I'm very much looking forward to reading her new book, which comes out very soon, Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, coming out on Duke University Press. Dr. Chatelain has also served on the boards of the Girl Scouts of Western Oklahoma and Radar Literary Arts in San Francisco. She's a member of the British Council's Transatlantic Network 2020 and a 2000 Harry Truman Scholar, as well as an alumna and honoree of the Sue Shear Institute for Women in Public Life and a 2011 German Marshall Fund of the US Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marcia Chatelain.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for devoting a part of your afternoon to something that is very important to me, and I know is important to many of you, and that is our nation's crisis in Ferguson, Missouri. This is my first time at Franklin and Marshall, but I had the pleasure of meeting one of your distinguished alumni, Akbar Hussain, who told me about this great college that he went to that opened up so many doors to him. I know Akbar through the Truman Scholarship, and the way he described Franklin and Marshall about this place where transformation happens reminds me a lot of my college experience at the University of Missouri and the decision I made to become a professor, because what I realized that entering the teaching profession was going to help me do is to help people get the skills that they need to make a difference in their own way. And so I think that this is an incredible moment where a lot of the lessons I learned as an undergraduate are coming together. And so I'm so excited to be at a place that's so focused on not only the student experience, but making sure that more and more Americans, regardless of their background, have an opportunity to have this experience. So today, I'm going to talk to you about a town called Ferguson, Missouri, and a place called America. We use the word Ferguson now. It's not just a proper noun anymore. It has just become a way of describing something. When people say, are we talking about Ferguson? Have you had a conversation about Ferguson? We're talking about something far deeper than what happened this summer. We're talking about reconciling our realities today with a deep and painful past, as well as our deep hope for the future. So, my relationship to Ferguson begins at the University of Missouri. Like many of you, I went away to college, and being a college student in a college town is kind of a strange relationship because you don't invest in the same ways, but it's a place where a lot of amazing things happen to you. And so I went to the University of Missouri as an out-of-state student. I was from Chicago originally, and I was from the big city, and I'm in this tiny town, and for me, tiny is like 70,000 people, but it was so little to me, right? And I'm in this tiny town, and I don't know what my relationship to this place is, but one of the things that I observed as an out-of-state student was that I was part of a very small cohort of students of color. And when I would ask other African American students or Latino students where they were from, they weren't from Missouri. And I thought this was unusual, that this place was filled with students who were from outside of the state. And that helped awake my consciousness about higher education and also think about the debt I owed to the people of Missouri for helping me finance an education that I wouldn't otherwise be able to afford and opening up my world. And so after I graduated from the University of Missouri, I became really committed to staying involved in the state and making sure that I was paying back this incredible education that I got. Like many of you, when I saw the first images from Ferguson, the initial thoughts that I had were, we've been down this road before, right? For those of you who are old enough to remember Los Angeles in 1992, for those of you who are old enough to remember Chicago in 1968, very few of you are old enough to remember, but may have read about, parts of Southern Illinois in 1919. This moment seemed very normal to me. The type of racialized unrest that happens in communities that has happened throughout history. And so, as a historian, you can get a little cynical sometimes. You're like, I've seen this story before, I know how it's gonna play out. So, as Ferguson unfolded, I watched the news like many people, say, okay, this is gonna be outside of the spotlight in 2 or 3 days. It's gonna blow over. I did an appearance on MSNBC to talk about Ferguson, and I said, this is an interesting moment, and I figured I would go on vacation, I'd come back, and no one was talking about Ferguson. But something was happening. Something was growing in that moment, that weeks later, months later, we are still talking about Ferguson, and I want us to think about why. Why this moment and why this incident. The other thing I want us to think about is how we have a conversation about Ferguson. So Joe was talking about how in August, professors and teachers are getting ready for a new school year. And the reason why I got involved in the national conversation about Ferguson is that I was really concerned for my incoming first-year students. I was afraid that the summer would be the way that they always remembered going away to college. I remembered how excited I would be to get ready for the summer to start the fall, and that Ferguson was this cloud that was hanging over young people, and my great fear was that the educators and the adults in their lives would take no responsibility in having a conversation about the fear, about the anxiety, about the grief that so many were having. When I think about Ferguson, Missouri, I think about all the kids who didn't get to start the first day of school. I think about the kids who, moving forward, every time they come to a college orientation, whether it's at Franklin and Marshall or Georgetown or the University of Missouri, and someone says, "Where are you from?" and they say Ferguson, Missouri, that will mean something. And so if all of these kids were having all of these feelings, the least we could do as a national community is have a conversation. And these conversations about race and about community and policing, they aren't easy conversations. But what was also happening at the time were my friends who were organizers in Ferguson were sending me text messages that said, "I just was tear gassed. I'm in a church right now, and the police have come and taken all of our supplies. I'm spending time with Michael Brown's family, and they're so distraught. And so, as I knew that people were really close to what was happening in Ferguson, the idea of talking about Ferguson in a classroom seemed like the least I could do to stand in solidarity with people who had given up so much to really support people in Ferguson, Missouri. So the story of Ferguson doesn't begin in August 2014. You could say that the story of Ferguson is the story of the 20th century in the United States. And so in order to appreciate what has happened in a place like Ferguson and places across the country, the first thing we have to think about is where people live, about the legacy of housing discrimination, about entire communities that are built on the premise of who can be there and who cannot be there. So Ferguson, like a lot of suburbs throughout the country, was built on this idea of racial exclusion. So this is an advertisement for Ferguson Hills, and it's a subdivision with beautiful brick and frame homes, something that everyone would want. But Ferguson was a place that there was an unspoken and clearly observed rule that it was only for whites. This goes back to the early 20th century. Here we have an advertisement for an area of St. Louis, and it says, "Look at these homes now, save your home, vote for segregation." For those of you who've taken US history classes, you know that the housing boom of the mid-century allowed so many American families to own homes for the first time. But part of the economic dream of owning a home was so deeply tied into racial segregation that when we wonder why communities are so deeply divided, when we wonder why today more American children than in 1954 go to segregated schools, when we wonder how did this all happen, it all goes back to the places we live in. Our homes are not just the place that we sleep and eat and spend time with our families. They are also part of communities that teach us about what's most important. To understand Ferguson, you also have to understand a practice called redlining. And it was a practice in which banks would literally decide where people could get home loans and where they couldn't. So this map here shows the red areas of the St. Louis metro area. These are places where people could not get good loans to buy homes, and these places were mostly African American. To understand Ferguson, you also have to understand what a sundown town is. And sundown towns were towns that made it clear that after sundown, people of color could not be in those towns. Ferguson, Missouri was a place in which there was one road for African Americans who worked for families in Ferguson they were allowed to come in and out of, and that was the only way they could do that safely. So when we think about historical tensions, all of us have some ideas of our families, and sometimes we have family members who don't talk to each other, and if you ask your parents, why don't you talk, they'll say it's none of your business, right? I'll tell you when you're older. At least in my family they do that. But the point is that when we have these kind of long-standing conflicts or there's tension, we don't know where it comes from, we often have to look at the roots of it. And so although many people in the town of Ferguson maybe don't remember the days of the sundown town, the legacy of these practices are so embedded in what people do and the dynamics of the community that to appreciate the intensity of the moment, we have to understand the context. To really appreciate Ferguson, you also have to know the story of Larman Williams. Larman Williams was the first African-American resident of Ferguson, Missouri. He bought a home there in 1968. He was only able to buy a home there because a friend from church who was white helped broker the deal. And when Larman Williams talks about his early days of living in Ferguson, he talks about neighbors immediately selling their homes and moving away. He talks about the fact that he couldn't get his garbage picked up, but the police would regularly come to his home. And he talks about this feeling of just wanting a nice place for his family to live and not being able to be at ease. In order to appreciate St. Louis and Ferguson, you have to know the story of Pruitt-Igoe. There's a great documentary about this called The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, and it's about public housing in St. Louis. And as more African Americans moved to St. Louis from places in the South, they didn't have a place to live. And so there was an opportunity to live in large-scale public housing. And it was built in 1954, and this was going to be a place that would allow segregation to continue and allow African American families to live in St. Louis. But shortly after these homes were built, the condition of the homes were never kept up. The federal government provided the allocation to build the homes, but not maintain it. The rents could not keep the heat on. People had ice coming in under the doorways in the winter, right? Men weren't allowed to live in a lot of these homes because of policies around welfare. So a number of women felt very under attack and very afraid to live there. Children didn't have playgrounds to live in. And so by 1972, the entire complex was imploded because it was considered a symbol of the poor quality of public housing, but it's also a symbol of what happens when communities resist change and when people don't have decent places to live. In order to appreciate Ferguson, you also have to understand that school segregation also helped build this community. Here's a picture of a school in the town of Berkeley. Berkeley was the black part of the St. Louis suburb, and here you see classes of all black students. Kinloch, Missouri, again, another all black town, and it only served black students. And what's interesting about that is that if you look at the data today of what students' experiences are according to race in Ferguson, very little has changed since the period where those school pictures were taken. 77% of students in the Ferguson Fluorescent School District are black. The percentage of students who receive out-of-school school suspensions, 87% of them are black. And if you look at the number of students subject to school-related arrests in the school district by race, all of them are black. And so one of the things that I thought was really amazing about the aftermath of Ferguson is that activists in the community were not just talking about police practices or police brutality or the details of what happened between Michael Brown and Darren Wilson. They were talking about the school that Michael Brown graduated from. They were talking about the inequalities in the school system, where 2/3 of the children who attend those schools are eligible for reduced lunch because their family meets requirements for the poverty line, right? And so one of the things that I think is really great about this movement and about this moment that's being run by so many thoughtful young people is that they're thinking about the bigger picture of what justice looks like. That it isn't about interactions between two people, but it's about all of the forces that come together that either make communities stronger or make communities weaker. Here's a great infographic from the University of Pennsylvania, again, about school district closures, about the inequalities within the school system among different racial groups in Ferguson Fluorescent School District. The issue of poverty is also part of this question about Ferguson. One of the things that was revealed in a lot of the investigations around Ferguson was the number of poor families that, as a result of speeding tickets, parking tickets, municipal tickets, were unable to pay these tickets and then found themselves in jail having to pay court fees and different penalties. And we see the growth of poverty in Ferguson, Missouri from 2000 to 2010. So the dark blue represents the poverty rates between 40 and 100%, and we see the growth of it in the areas surrounding Ferguson. And ultimately, this is a story about grief. I think that we can't lose sight of what happened. A lot of people have asked me when I do these talks, why is Ferguson different? What happened in Ferguson that didn't happen in Sanford, Florida when Trayvon Martin was shot, or that didn't happen outside of Detroit when Renisha McBride was shot? And I think that the thing that I often return to is that on August 9th, an entire community watched a member of that community dead on the ground for several hours. That unlike some of these other cases in which emergency medical forces are called in immediately, or other incidents that happen under the cloak of night, a community had to watch one of its members dead for several hours. And I think that changes people. For the students who participated in the die-in, you were part of a large network of people across the country who are symbolically dying in to think about what does it mean to connect grief and action. And something changes in you when you see that. I hope no one in this room has ever had the experience of watching a corpse for that long and seeing people take video of it and seeing people react to loss in such a raw way. But I think that is part of the story, that the story of Ferguson is a story of grief. And I think that it's important in all of our conversations to honor that. Michael Brown left the house one day and he didn't come back home. And I think that for his family and for his community, his not coming home was about something bigger than this moment. And that is why I think Ferguson continues to be an important topic for all of us and continues to inspire movement with various tactics, with various questions. I'm going to end here so we can have a robust conversation. But the last thing I want to say to the students particularly, as you grapple about kind of where you fit in this moment, a lot of people will say you are doing it wrong. People will say that dying in makes no difference. People will say that talking about Ferguson makes no difference. People will say that spending time on social media talking about this will make no difference. But one of the things I do know for sure, that like any process, whether it's riding a bike, succeeding in college, succeeding in relationships, in love, you have to keep doing. Movements will make a lot of mistakes. There will be a lot of missteps, there will be a lot of mishaps, there'll be some disagreements, and there will be a lot of discord. But I think it is appropriate on this day, where we honor the birth of Martin Luther King, that we understand that change is not a direct line from darkness into light, but it's a journey that has a lot of ups and downs and a lot of disappointments. And people told King he was doing everything wrong, and people will tell you you're doing everything wrong. But every act of conscience, every act of commitment, every act of struggle brings us as a community and as a nation closer to the things that we want to see. So I'm going to stop there and really open it up for conversation, because I think that that's probably the best thing that we have available to all of us to fight for a better world and to see the things that we want manifest. So thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Fatu. I'm a junior at FNM. I'm studying government and business. And I want you to talk a little bit about, in terms of the media, through the film that are made, like Starmo, for example, that came out a couple of weeks ago, and 12 Years of Slave, and how those things that are put in theater for people to go see, how that is either negatively or positively impacting this movement.
That's a great question. So listen, we are living in very difficult times right now, okay? There's a lot of conflict and there's a lot of sadness. And I've really committed myself in the new year to love and optimism. So I'm gonna say something positive and then be more of myself and say something kind of grouchy. So here's my optimism. The other day I was on a panel with historians and everyone is complaining about how the media has portrayed protesters and this movement, and everyone gets it wrong and no one has anything to say, and we were like being super professory about it. I tell my students Professor Facebook is like the worst Facebook, because it's like student complaints and everything that's wrong with the New York Times. But I will say this. This is what I will say, and this is my optimism. When I look at the young writers and reporters who report on Ferguson, I can see the impact that their college education has had on them in the way that they frame the conversation. The way that someone like Yamiche Alcindor, Georgetown graduate, is writing for USA Today. People like Wesley Laurie, like the questions that they're asking, I think is a direct impact of the type of education that we provide, where we talk about the civil rights movement as not just about King saving the day, but about people on the ground making a difference. I think the fact that people are talking about the work that women are doing in a way that movements in the past have had very little coverage of the very specific types of leaders that women make in these movements and these moments, and people are talking about that. They're talking about other groups that are not associated naturally with the issue of racial justice and their contributions, right? So we see members of the LGBT community talking about Ferguson because they're being asked about Ferguson, because people are understanding that the more connected our communities are, the better we do. So I think that there has been a level of sophistication about the conversation around Ferguson, and I like to take credit as a professor saying, see, these kids took all these great classes in college and professors have saved the day. And at the same time, I will say this, I have not seen the movie Selma. I'm sure it is beautiful. I try not to watch movies about history because I'm too grumpy. I'll be like, that didn't happen. This is wrong. And the reason why I get so upset, it's not that I don't appreciate a good piece of art, is my concern is that until we get to a point where all members of the audience can know what is fiction and what is fact, I get nervous when movies start to stand in for the real thing, because as a historian, history is dramatic and sexy and enticing and interesting without any changes to it. You could do a really great movie about the civil rights movement and it would have struggle, it would have love, it would have conflict, it would have very attractive people, it would have everything that a Hollywood movie has. And you don't even need the fictionalizing of any of it, right? And so I think it's a question of genre, but I think fiction should always have its own commitments to genre. But I do fear that when my students say, well, I saw a movie like The Help, and didn't this happen? I'm like, no, none of it happened. And it would not happen this way. Has anyone seen the movie The Help? I'm gonna stop here in a second because I have a whole thing about The Help. But in The Help, there's this very honest dialogue about race in 1963 Jackson, Mississippi. If these things were to happen, people would have ended up dead. For us to appreciate kind of what stakes and what risks people took during the civil rights movement, to write a tell-all book about the racial culture of the Deep South and no one ends up dead is so inconsistent with what we know. Small acts could get a person killed. So these are the things that keep me grumpy on Facebook, but am so hopeful about the way this conversation's happening, and I think the conversation's great because young people are really kind of driving that, and so I think it's fantastic.
Hello, my name is Emily Meneghine. I'm a senior theater and Italian joint major. I co-founded Voices for Justice here, which we're still working on getting on its feet. Thank you so much for speaking. I really appreciated your talk. I wanted to ask you about responding to use a very flippant word, things that happen. I wanted to ask about like the formality versus like an informality. Like I'm a big advocate of like just having like actual conversations about things, but on the other hand, there is a need for like a formalized like for example, I want my professor to speak of this, or like I want like a common hour like about this, rather than just it like. So what can you speak to like the effectiveness and cons, I suppose, to like formal like structured conversations and just having like a culture shift in like the way we're dialoguing with each other?
Yes. So I think you're getting at the heart of why movement is difficult. Sometimes in my classes, I'll tell the students, like, there's one of me and there's more of you. Why don't you ever just like walk out? Or why don't you ever just like come attack me? There's so many, I mean, the power differential is weird. Like everyone is sitting down listening to me because I'm standing here, but this is weird. There's more of you than there is of me. So if everyone wants to turn on me right now, I have nothing, right? So, and the reason why I bring that up as an example is that I think for students particularly, a lot of this is really experimenting with different ways of thinking about sharing power. So when I was at the University of Oklahoma, there was a student group and they had no leader. Everyone was the leader because everyone had something to offer. So everyone would take turns leading a meeting at the time, and a student said, Professor Chatelain, isn't that the dumbest thing you've ever seen? And I said, isn't that the greatest thing you've ever seen? Because what a different way of thinking about democracy. And it is a constant challenge. No one does it right. King wasn't perfect at it, right? The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John Lewis, all of these people struggled with this thing called democratic action and the sharing of power. But just because we share power in different settings doesn't mean we don't have different resources to bring. So as college students, you have this incredible power here because people listen to you, you're very smart, you have this open environment, and so how do you bring this to people in Lancaster who never get to go to college? How do you bring these skills together to communities so that they can have something to also work with? And it's a struggle, but the thing that I think all of these processes need is a lot of joy and a lot of love. Like, it cannot be sadness all the time. There has to be happiness too. And a student asked me once at the Georgetown Law Center, a white student said, you know, as a white person, how do I stand in solidarity in these moments? And I said, show up when people are happy. That death and devastation should not be the only time you want to be in racial solidarity. How about when someone's having a birthday or like a party or being happy, right? Because we want communities to be connected in struggle, but if we never connect in any other context than struggle, we can't really do anything. And so one of the greatest lessons I had when I was a student at the University of Missouri was being in these activist organizations, and we actually liked each other. And we would like make breakfast at each other's houses, and then we would talk about television, and we would love each other so that struggle was not the only thing that kept us together, because that's not the only thing that can keep a community strong. And in terms of kind of different ways, do all of them. So like run for student like government and do that thing, and then die in here, and then die in your classes, die in at trustee meetings. I mean, like mix it up. Test it out. You're going to make tons of mistakes, but the beauty of it, right, is the ability to know that you are more than one thing. So I think everything you do is great, and I think anything that brings the conversations in different places is also really helpful, whether they're formal or informal.
Good afternoon. My name is Karen Miller. I'm a senior English creative writing major. So my question is sort of two parts. As an English major, I pay a lot of attention to language. So could you talk a little bit about the uses of the words riots and protests and how those get attached to different groups of people? And the second part of that question is sort of, a lot of people sort of criticize riots, but personally I feel like there's sort of an underlying language under there. And do you think sort of that language is being undercut by media coverage or social media or anything like that?
Absolutely. So there are a few ways that Ferguson and this moment have been talked about that are all about reinforcing certain ideas. And so the first one that I always take issue with is the killing of unarmed black men. Those are not the only people who are under attack as a result of different types of brutality. That women may not be victimized by guns, but they can be very easily victimized by sexual violence and intimidation. I think that we still have to kind of break people out of the pattern of thinking it is only black men. We have large instances of police brutality and violence with Native American populations. I think that the LGBTQ community has been very good about talking about the way that transgendered people are also targeted. So just even in the framing of the conversation, the shorthand of who's a victim and who's not needs some tweaking. The idea of riot and protest. Riot is a very difficult term because we've thought of the word riot has often been looked at by sociologists, and a lot of people resist the idea of riot because it has this implication that people have done something completely bad and unjustified and then therefore have no space to say anything in the political process. And I think that that is a dangerous idea, that whether or not a citizen complies with the law, that we have to respect the basic human dignity of all people. And this is an incredibly challenging thing, right? So for my students who are deeply committed to Ferguson, they can be very derailed when people say, well, what about the people who rioted? Where do you put people within a context where they're not complying with what you want them to do and still respect their dignity as a human being? In the same ways, what do we do with Darren Wilson? Right? He's a young man who took someone else's life. This is a person who is also a victim, in a sense, of what happens, right? Because he had to be he has to deal with the consequences of his behavior as well, even if we don't think of him as sympathetic. And so I think that those kind of murky challenges are where most productive thinking about this happens. But I do think that riot protest is also an interesting dichotomy, because what it draws in terms of support, it's often used to invalidate all the claims. So it's, it's when people say this, like, the people I really feel badly for are the people whose businesses were harmed. Well, can we feel badly for the people whose businesses were harmed, the kids who are getting an inadequate education in Ferguson, the young people who are really, really angry, the families that are struggling, and the people who don't know what to make of this? Can we imagine our compassion having coverage for all people, and then say, and as a result of all of these people who suffer as a result of racism and economic injustice, can we love all of them and imagine a community that can take care of all of them? I think we see very similar things when people struggle with mass incarceration, with the relationship to the police. We do not want a police force that abuses citizens they're supposed to protect, and we want communities to be safe, and if they need protection, we want to be able to have some force helping us, right? So all of these kind of uncomfortable things that we struggle with, that is what we should be talking about. This kind of bifurcated, I'm team this, I'm team that, is the most useless way of framing any moment, because it's the things that we're not entirely sure how we feel about that will motivate us to kind of be more creative and to do more thinking. So I think that's a great question. And also, just last thing, I love college sports. We saw what happened in Columbus after Ohio State won the national championship. And so the idea that recklessness and violence is this byproduct of youth that we just kind of accept and is okay is also part of this kind of racialized question about riot versus protest. The last thing I'll say about this, I can go on forever, but peaceful protest is also an interesting one too, where people will say, I support the peaceful protesters and everyone else can go to hell. Like, that's not, no, we can't do that. We have to say, we need to listen to everyone who's really angry about this moment, and what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to be responsible? And I think that's the toughest part. Yes.
Hi, my name is Livia Menegin. I'm an English creative writing major as well. My sister just asked a question.
Okay, I was wondering. I was so freaked out. I said, this is really, I need to get more sleep. I swear this girl just asked a question, and okay. Nice to meet you.
My question goes along with Karen's and Emily's about fear in the response. Last semester was particularly difficult for me, going home for the holidays and trying to talk about this with my family, who are very pro cops, and it's like, why are you picking a side, and trying to deal with finals when I have all this stuck in my head. Yes. I'm a writer too, so I'm trying to get it out somehow, and everything's all up inside, and I'm just scared. So I was just wondering if you could talk about fear in the response, not only to feel free to speak your mind, but also just to not have to feel like you're going through the motions, not acknowledging something and just taking a step as a time to pause.
I think that's a great question, because this is something that's very real, and I think in a lot of campuses there were students who really challenged universities to take this in mind. How do you keep on learning? How do you keep on having college in a moment of so much deep suffering, and when students are in solidarity? And this was a challenge for the faculty too. No one is immune from this. And so I think as we kind of figure out what this community called college is, we have to acknowledge that this is not easy. And so I spend so much time talking about this stuff that I also reach my limits where I am not going to talk about this for a day, or I will not engage this for a day, because as people, we cannot just be one note. But the family and friends thing was a huge thing. When we got back from winter break, I said, how many people talked about what's happening at home? And students of all colors, of all backgrounds said, my parents just didn't understand why this was important to me. We had groups of students go to Ferguson, and some students said, their parents said, we're not paying for your college if you're going to do this. How do you respect the community that you come from and then disagree with it? This is a lifelong struggle that you will feel as an adult, but the tips I will provide is, sometimes you don't have to engage. I think sometimes we engage because we want to either convince someone else that they're wrong or dumb, but sometimes we can lovingly disengage and say, we disagree about this. and I love you for these reasons, but we're never going to see eye to eye on this, and this is okay. I think that we should allow ourselves that possibility, no matter how deeply impassioned we are on an issue. And sometimes I've told students, you know, when you're kind of having conflict with your parents about this issue, say, you know, Mom, Dad, the reason why this is important to me is because I know how much you love me. And Michael Brown's parents said goodbye to him one day and he never came home. And I think that's just really awful. I would hate to have to leave home and not be able to come back to you. And when we reduce it to its most basic terms, that grief and that sadness, it doesn't necessarily mean everyone agrees with it all of a sudden, but when we root our political discourse only on the level of politics, only on the level of conflict, and not really acknowledge the true pain that also is part of it, I think we lose sight of our humanity and we lose sight of the ability of others to kind of see where we're coming from. I think that one of the most difficult things about talking about race a lot is that I often have to remember to say, and this is very painful, and this hurts, this ruins your holidays, it makes it difficult to be happy because this is very painful. And once we talk about that, we're able to feel like we can get ourselves back together again. So what you're talking about is very real. I think everyone I know who's an educator felt it too. They felt it for their students. And then the challenge is for educators in the room, how do we accommodate that? How do we make sure that we're not so driven by we have to get to the end of the semester that we don't acknowledge that our students are also in a growth process. Talking about Ferguson in the classroom, I really did not think this would become a thing. And honestly, when I think about Ferguson's syllabus, it was a way to shame other people to make them talk about Ferguson. It was like bullying online, if you will. But what came out of it, right, is that people said, you know, by doing this, I was really afraid. I didn't think I had the tools, but I knew I was not the only one doing this. And the people who I'm most kind of blown away by are the teachers who teach K through 12. The people who don't have the kind of academic freedom that I have, or the people on campuses where this is not embraced, and they said, you know what, my principal said we're not going to talk about Ferguson, but I made sure that we talked about, you know, civic responsibility. I made sure that the kids knew that we could talk about these things in these different ways. And that kind of creativity and that kind of courage, you know, we have to honor that by being really honest about what we can bring forward. So I'm with you 100% on that.
Hi, I'll probably have to hold this because I'm a little... my question is, first of all, my name is Terry. I work at the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. Mm-hmm. My question about the Ferguson thing is, we have Africans who come straight from Africa, how they're either in like resettlement or refugees or for education as well. Now, before they even go out there and protest, they feel like they should receive some kind of acceptance into the African American communities. Mm-hmm. First of all, it's because a lot of people think that Africa is one country, yes, which is probably, it's a country true. With 54 countries. You know, yes. So that acceptance is probably what they would need first. Do you have any idea for them to make that approach?
So this is an interesting point that you bring up, and I see this sometimes when students will say, you know, my family is from a context that is not the African American context. And so pushing back on civil authority in this way, shutting down a highway, protest, this is not a context that my family understands in this way. And I think that the only way we can kind of unite communities that in some way have some common experiences but then are so disparate in their background is history, is the learning. You know, I think that for immigrant populations that are worried about repercussions as a result of their immigration status, or just a sensibility that I don't understand why everyone is so mad. I think that in the US, sometimes it's a very difficult sell to say that this is a place where inequality exists when we have places around the world where people can't imagine the quality and standard of life that we have here also in the US. And so I think that we reduce those conflicts and burden by really providing context. So I think Ferguson is not just about police brutality. I actually think it's a story about housing segregation. I think it's about not having the access to create the type of stable community and families that most people want, right? And so when you talk about it in those terms, when you talk about it in terms of, well, this is a context that may be like our context in the sense that there's this type of exclusionary patterns, there's this type of thing that you can get people on common ground. But I think that for working with immigrant populations, also listening to the context that other people come from. So when they say, I don't get what's going on, instead of saying, well, you're wrong and you should get it, say, well, why don't you get it? You know, like, what is it like when the police violate the rights of citizens where you're from? Or what are your expectations for the police? Or what are your expectations for the civil government? And so when we talk about kind of differing expectations and different frameworks, I think we draw closer to saying, okay, this is why this is happening. So thank you for your question.
Hello, my name is Ryan Kozlowski. I'm a sophomore chemistry major. And I was just kind of wondering, with all of, you say have a conversation, I was kind of wondering, with all the polarized back and forth, and you say don't take a side, there's so much information out there that's from one side or from the other side, and bias and everything. How do we separate what we should really know and really understand to have those educated conversations and to make progress from all of the blah, blah, blah that
So there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise, and there's a lot of noise from people who have access to the internet and access to my Twitter account. So there's like a lot of like feedback, solicited and not solicited, that I get. So, and people often say, well, is this just a matter, like sometimes people say, if you just read the grand jury testimony, then you'll know everything you need to know about Ferguson, and then you can just shut up. But I think what this moment has taught us, because people are still talking about it, is because we understand that it's bigger than one incident. And so the idea of taking sides, I mean, I do think that there's strong positions that people can take, but I guess the thing that I think is most productive in a conversation is to say what one actually feels about this, right? So you can think a number of things, but you know, I'm really uncomfortable with all this protesting. And then a person says, well, why? You say, well, you know, on one hand, I think, you know, the justice system does what it does, and if it's imperfect, people should just accept that. And a person say, well, I'm uncomfortable with that. That, I think, can be a civil conversation. If both people are invested in this idea that we're not going to then say, well, I read this thing, and this person said this thing, and it's better than your thing. So I guess what I'm saying is that, yes, there's biased perspective, and there are the things that your conscious are leading you to. You start there, and then someone will say, well, actually, if you read about this thing, you might have a broader perspective. And you say, okay, I'll be open to that. I guess what I'm suggesting is that when people, the initial reaction to talking about Ferguson in the classroom, people imagine something really terrible. Like one side of the classroom does this, and the other side does this, and everyone's gonna start fighting. And what I say is actually, there's some really basic tools that we have as people that we can just have a conversation. We can be uncomfortable and say, you know what, at the end of this conversation, I really don't agree with you, and I have enough respect for you to tell you that instead of like tweeting about how you're an awful person. I mean, I think part of the challenge of this time is really pushing our communication skills. It's requiring us to be comfortable with discomfort, being honest, and actually being very open with our emotions. These three elements are probably the most difficult things for all people to do, but when we use a combination of our human skills, we don't have to overthink it, we can actually engage. And it requires a kind of existential and emotional strength that I think that this moment is testing in all of us, and I think that we can actually build up as a result.
Hi, I'm Susan Manasian, the college chaplain. I want to thank you in particular for your words about how do we put grief into action. Mm-hmm. And what I have experienced in listening to students, faculty, and staff is that there is a depth of grief and not knowing how to put words to that. So there was a group, 2 professors started with no words. And one student said there's an irony in that because a lot of what we're doing is words. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times we have no words. So I want to give a shout out to the cards that have been given and are available for people. It says, write one thing you're most afraid to say aloud. Mm-hmm. And we're collecting these. So in the midst of no words, I mean, I think you've modeled for us how to put language to our grief. Sometimes people just can't articulate it, you know? So Sunday night we're having a ritual of lament. Monday night, to close out Martin Luther King Day. And I said, we will not sing We Shall Overcome. I really don't want to hear that in the rest until Monday's over, or really ever again. Mm-hmm. I mean, I sit with an angst of lament, like the psalmist, and, you know, I look back at the history and then I go, and we're still doing this? Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with, at the end of the day, sitting with what I'm going to assume is still not the academic, mm-hmm. but the individual with that heaviness of the lament that's got to be in your heart?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just to tell you a story about, so these different stories started to come forward after Michael Brown. So we see Eric Garner, you know, being killed on a public street, and the John Crawford at the Walmart in Ohio, right? He has this toy gun with him, he's minding his own business, and the police come in and he's killed in a state that has open carry laws, just to add the fine point. But one of the things I think was interesting, in this whole thing, people often bring up their families. I'm afraid for my son, I'm afraid for my daughter. I don't have children. My brother is a very law and order kind of guy. You know, my brother will not be dying in anywhere ever. And my brother believes, you know, you follow the rules and life is good. And sometimes we have conflict about our different perspectives. But my brother is an avid hunter, and so is his son. And when I saw John Crawford at that Walmart, gunned down with a toy gun, that was the first moment I thought, this is the kind of situation I could see my brother in. If my brother is ever pulled over by the police, he would give his ID. He would never resist. He would think, you're doing the right thing. But I think about my brother playing with a gun in a Walmart. And I think this is the type of fear and anxiety that maybe in a sense I had been suppressing, but seeing that I said, oh God, what if this happened to my brother? I have to call him and tell him never to, you know, don't buy guns ever again, right? And it's that fear and anxiety that we can sometimes be trapped in and feel like there's no hope. And so how do I sit with it? I sit with it a lot. I cry a whole bunch, and then after I'm done crying, I also laugh. I allow myself the possibility of having a lot of dimensions so that I don't think grief is the only thing that I have available to me, and I don't think kind of like laughter as a tool to keep me from feeling is the only thing I have about me. But to be very honest, this took like years of therapy. I really believe in like counseling, you know, spiritual journeys, also having friends that are real friends, like being connected to people that you actually like, not just the people on Facebook, but the idea of building a community and having things that are very joyful. I often tell students, like, okay, I know that you traveled in solidarity, you've been protesting for 5 nights, are you hanging out? Are you having fun? I was a very high-achieving college student, and I remember once a professor who was a very different political orientation of mine, was a great mentor, he said, you're doing really well, are you sleeping? I said, well, I don't know, why is that your business? And he goes, I want to know why you're sleeping, because I remember I ran for office, and I fell into a deep depression, and I had to be hospitalized because I just kept on going and I didn't stop. I see that in you, so are you sleeping? And I feel like in all my years of college, that's probably the most caring thing that anyone has ever said or done for me. And so I think for those of us who work with students, instead of saying, like, did you turn this in? I said, like, are you sleeping? Do you and your friends have fun anymore? After you organize, how do you spend time with each other in community? Because I think that the grief is so overwhelming and it is so powerful, and we have to help each other do it. The other thing you can do for each other is, like, be helpful. That's the other thing. Like, I remember once I was really sick in college, someone came into my house and cleaned it for me. That was the most loving thing I could think of someone to do. When my friends are having a hard time, sometimes I like make them food and bring it to them, right? I think sometimes we miss that caretaking element that also is part of making a difference. And so I think that we all have it in us to do something different, to make sure we never have these types of conversation again, so we can move forward. On that note, I've gotten the 1 minute. One more question. So who's going to have the final word on this? You are.
Thank you so much for your remarks. I'm also a professor of history, and I've also tried to encourage revolt in my own classroom, so we're kindred spirits. So I was wondering, it sounds like part of what we do in classroom is encourage arguments based on evidence, but it sounds like you're also suggesting we could build spaces for different kinds of conversations about emotions. So maybe your parting words could be some tools for us as instructors to signal that, and as students, how do we ask, Professor, may I have this safe space for that?
Just act like a person. Here's the thing, folks. You may think I'm very bright, or you may think I am not bright. That is not important to me. I think after years of being in the teaching profession, whether my students think I'm smart becomes less and less important. It's whether or not my students think I'm a human. And I think that that has become the more important goal. When you first start on your career, you want to be like Professor Elbow Patches and be super smart, and you're so serious because you want everyone to feel the intensity of your intellect. That is not interesting or important. What you want to model to your students is how a thinking person exists as a loving human being in the world, and you just do that. And so, I mean, you know, you do that within professional boundaries, like you show up to your job and you actually assign tests, but you ask students about who they are. So, you know, not what your major is, like, oh, so what was it like, you know, leaving home to come here? Or, you know, what do you think of this experience? The thing that I always want my students to feel at the end of the semester, I always say, if you learn nothing from me, and maybe you will, but if there's one thing that you can take away is that what we do in the classroom is give each other an opportunity to learn how to love learning more and love each other even more. And so as long as we keep that front and center in our interactions, in our exasperation with our students when they do something really flaky and annoying, in our ability to confront tension in the classroom. If we say, hey guys, we're here to just love each other more and the world in a more deep way so we can change it, so why don't we just, like, you know, reframe? I have to say, I've had an incredible time. I talk about race all the time. Sometimes people want to, sometimes they don't, but I think that they can always walk away saying that I'm wanting to do this from a really loving and peaceful way, and they join me, regardless of where I'm teaching. And so I think that, you know, our commitment to that, that's what college did for me, and I know that's what this experience is doing for all of us, and we can just call it that, and we can really move forward. This has been so fantastic. I'm gonna ask everyone a favor. So I have a student working for me, and she used to work in Cory Booker's office, and if you know Cory Booker, senator from New Jersey, he is obsessed with social media and Twitter, and she says, Professor Chatelain, you need to start taking selfies with audiences that you talk to. So I'm gonna take a real big, quick picture right now. I will not become Cory Booker, but this is the closest thing I have, okay? So just indulge me. This is working. Wait, my finger's up. All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Chatelain.